And we are live. This is today's Live with Sondra. I'm your host, Sondra Shannon, CEO of Gatemaster Technology, and I've got a guest for you today. But first, I want you to think about something. I want you to think about your last visit to a theme park and what stood out to you the most. Is it the safety measures and the efficiency of the rides, or the overall experience of waiting in line? And how did those elements shape your day? So before we get started with this guest that I have today, I just want you to think about that question. What are those things? Because we're going to be talking about all of these things in today's show, which is titled The Human Factor in Ride Safety and Queue Design. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to our guest, our special guest for the day, Neil Wilson. Neil is an expert who has written a book, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this. But he started as a ride host at Alton Towers and worked globally at Europa Park and Epcot. He built Dreamland's rides department, managing over 80 staff members and also was instrumental in creating operational procedures. He's the author of the book Absolute Efficiency. And this is the first book on queue management in theme parks. He's also a senior consultant for Universal Verification, specializing in safety, auditing, and training. And he believes comedy broadens perspectives, exposes truth, and feels like home, especially British humor. So I'm very excited to introduce you to Neil today. Neil, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sondra. Thank you. It's great to be joining you tonight, or
Thank you.
in the day where you are.
Yeah, I know we got a little bit we're going global with this show. I'm loving how many of my guests have been able to join me from all over the world, but I know it must be late for you. What time you got there?
Oh, 6 o'clock. So no, not too
Oh, so
late.
not too late. Okay, well, you didn't have
I'm
to get
not a
up
late night
for
person,
me.
but I
Yeah.
won't put my pajamas on just yet.
Well, I really I introduced you in the bio, but I wanted to make sure. Is there anything that you want to add to that, Neil? Is there anything that the audience needs to know about you before we get started? Because I've got a lot of questions for you.
No, that was a really lovely introduction, actually. No, I really appreciate you saying all that. So no, I think you've covered the main stuff there.
Well, what I love about your experience, and I'm very excited to jump into the questions that we have, learn more about your book. But I love that, like so many of us, you started in this industry because you just started with a job in this industry, and it became a passion for you, as your bio has. So it definitely highlights that part of your journey in your career. And I love having people like you on the show who started as ride host or started in some sort of operational department in a theme park and have worked their way up to these expert levels. And I really appreciate you being here to share what you've learned with our audience today, because I think it's super valuable. So you've had an incredible journey in the theme park industry, starting as ride operator, becoming a senior consultant, and now the author of the book Absolute Efficiency. With your vast experience, what is the most, and this is me going a little bit off script, because I was curious when I read your bio on who you were, but I'm curious what the most surprising lesson is that you've learned about the role of human behavior in ensuring ride safety and improving queue management, just to kind of kick us off.
So in terms of sort of human behaviour, I think it's often sort of misunderstood. A lot of people have sort of heard about pop psychology, and there's a lot of representations of psychology in popular culture. So you get quite a few detective things at the moment, where the detective is meant to be a psychologist, and a lot of people have seen sort of stage hypnotists or mentalist magicians. But in terms of psychology, it's all about using sort of data to understand about the sort of human factors, whether it's in accidents or efficiency. So yeah, there have been some interesting lessons. Probably in some ways it's hard to pick one thing, but I mean, there's reading a study recently about young car drivers, which I think is quite applicable to theme parks. So I don't know how it is in the US, but certainly in the UK, if you're under 25, you generally pay a lot more for your car insurance than you do if you're older, because young car drivers are involved in a lot more accidents than older drivers, which I think is quite applicable to theme parks where we have a lot of young staff working. So I suppose the obvious question is, why are younger drivers in more car accidents? And does that mean that young ride operators are also more likely to cause more accidents? So there's an interesting study in the UK looking at all the data from car accidents. And some of the factors were fairly obvious. They found that young drivers do more driving after dark, was a factor. And young drivers are also more likely to drink drive. So if you take out drink driving accidents, the difference in accidents between younger drivers and older drivers is a lot less. But one of the other factors that really stood out is the difference in accident rate between young drivers driving on their own and older drivers driving on their own is pretty much non-existent. Most of the difference is actually between young drivers with other young people in the car and older drivers. So the reason young drivers have a lot of car accidents is something to do with the other people in the car. And that might be because they're distracting them. It might be because they're of peer pressure. It could be for something else. And I suppose that gives us lessons that we can maybe take to theme park rides, because actually there's not loads of data about theme park safety. There's a lot more data about things like road safety or airline safety. So if we want to learn about the human factors in accidents, we often need to take data for other areas of health and safety, like car accidents, and then sort of apply it to theme parks, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never thought about it from that perspective, but it makes sense, right? Because they are operating machines in some cases and or guiding a guest through an experience. And I've got a young driver right now getting ready to drive. So this is very applicable to my personal life. She's about to turn 18. She waited till her 18th birthday. Me, on the other hand, 16, I was in a car ready to go. But I am finding that there's even a little hesitation with today's young people with regards to driving so soon. I don't know about where you are in the UK, but here in the States, more and more of my friends who are peers who have kids of that age are hesitating too to jump into this driving, experience that we all have to do as grown-ups to get ourselves from one place to the other. But what's interesting to me is I think, at least with my teenager, she really is overwhelmed with the idea of what a huge responsibility that it is to be in a vehicle, right?
It's a good thing. I think when you look at the data, I think there's often an assumption that the more confident someone is, the safer they're going to be. But actually, when you look at studies, actually the inverse can often be true, actually. So there's another study, again, it's not specific on theme parks, but it was on road safety, where
Sure.
they asked people to rate how good they were at driving, but they also asked people how many points they had on their license, because in the UK you can get points for things like speeding. And they also asked people to list any car accidents they've been in. And the more car accidents people have been in and the more points they had on the license, the safer they thought they were. And there was also another study where they got people to rate how good they thought they were at multitasking. And the better people said they thought they were at multitasking, the worse they actually did in an experimental multitasking. So they asked them to rate themselves, and then they gave them a test where they had to multitask. And the people who got the lowest scores in the test were the people who'd rated themselves the highest. So actually, people who have people aren't very good at rating their own ability to be safe. So actually, people who are more cautious actually generally, I mean, it is possible to be overcautious with driving if you're too slow
Sure.
pulling out at a junction, or if you're driving too slowly and then other drivers try to overtake you. But there's a lot more accidents caused by people being undercautious than overcautious. So I think that's a good sign, actually.
Yeah, I think so too. And I wonder if that's, if what I appreciate you opening up with this is I wonder if that is something that, when we talk about, how do you approach identifying and addressing the root cause of accidents in theme parks? Is this some of the data that you're using when determining that?
Definitely. I mean, I think there's two ways you can either approach it. You can either do a thorough investigation into a particular accident, or you can look at sets of data to look at trends. In terms of data for the theme park industry, Obviously, the advantage of looking at theme park accidents rather than accidents from something else is it's directly applicable to theme parks. If you want to make theme parks safer, it transfers directly if you're looking at ride accidents. The problem is getting good quality data. What you tend to find is for the most serious accidents, the data is very reliable and often quite thorough, but it's a very small sample size. So, for example, if we just looked at fatalities in theme parks, it's very good data, it's very reliable data because one, either someone's dead or they're not. You can't be sort of half dead. With other injuries, people can misrecord the
Sure.
injury, but no one's going to misrecord a fatality. And you can't really hide a fatality. You know, most countries, if there's a fatality in a workplace, it's going to be disclosed. Whereas once you start going to more minor accidents, it's relying a lot more on self-reporting. So there's more room for people to either underplay the severity of an accident or to just not report it. So the problem we have is if we're looking at the most serious accidents, it's a very, very small data size because there aren't, luckily, which is a good thing, there aren't that many really serious accidents in the attractions industry, which is a good thing, but it means it's, although the data is very reliable, we're looking at small sets. So if you're looking at trends and patterns, you're working with a small set of data. When we go to those more minor accidents, we've got this big data pool, but it's often quite unreliable and not very thorough. But there are some patterns we can spot. So, for example, if you look at recent serious accidents, I think it's pretty clear that the accident rate for employees tends to be quite a bit higher now than for visitors. The rate of accidents for visitors is incredibly low in theme parks, whereas and it is low for employees as well. It is low across the board, but we are still seeing more accidents with things like engineers being hit in ride areas. So there are still some trends you can look at. I mean, the other way you can get to the root causes of accidents is by taking an accident and then investigating it, you know, very thoroughly. So it's about being open-minded because you get kind of confirmation bias where the investigator basically decides how they think the accident happened and then they look for evidence to support it. And it's about, ideally, you want to have an accident investigation team because we've all got our own biases and prejudices. So hopefully, if you have several people looking into the accident, it can help to sort of avoid some of that. It's a bit like in a court. Ideally, you'll have more. It's better to have a jury. It's sometimes better to have a jury than it is to just have one judge because one, it sort of averages out any biases, and also just the process of discussing your findings can often lead to better understandings of what happened.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. And, I'm curious if you can share some examples of advanced controls or systems or restraints designs that can minimize risk for guests. And, let's start there because you just don't, I have a lot of questions for you today based on what you're talking about. But, I'm just curious, are there systems in place right now that or control systems that we can use to monitor this?
Yeah, definitely. I think we're moving a lot more towards those, partly because I think the more research comes out, the more we start to understand that the human brain is prone to error. And if you're relying on people to if you're relying on people to make good decisions, people will make mistakes. And also the technology is allowing us to do a lot more. So if you go back to the early days of rides, so certainly if you go back before the late 1930s, everything was completely manual. So there's lots of different theme park rides, but I'm just going to stick with a roller coaster here to make my points. So if you go back to say a roller coaster from the 1930s, everything would be manual. So if you wanted to turn a brake on, someone would have to pull a lever. If you wanted to turn that brake off, someone would have to pull the lever back. So you were relying on completely on people to make the right decisions at the right times. And if you had more than one train, if somebody made the wrong decisions, they could collide with each other. Then in the late 1930s, early 1940s, that was really when the first control system started coming in. So we're going back before computers here. So we're relying on basic electrical circuits and what we would call relay logic. So we started dividing rides up into block sections, say. So each ride would have different blocks, and which is a block is a section of track. And each section of track can only have one train in it at a time. So if a roller coaster gets to the end of one block, and the next block's occupied, the brakes would close and the train would stop so they don't crash into each other. But with kind of relay logic, it was kind of limited what you could do because you're just relying on electrical circuits opening and closing. There wasn't any actual sort of thought process in the ride because we didn't have computers. And then in the 1970s, with Space Mountain at Disney, that was the first time a roller coaster had a computer making decisions. So when we talk about control systems, the way they work now is you have inputs and outputs, and you have a computer between them. So you've got inputs that could include buttons. So, for example, the control panel, you might have emergency stops, and you've also got lots of sensors around the rides which are feeding information into the computer. And then you get outputs, which might be brakes opening or closing, or motors turning on and off. So that's your control system. And yeah, with modern control systems, you've got all these sensors that are looking at conditions. So for example, you mentioned restraints, I think. So on an old ride, might be completely relying on the customer to make sure their restraint is closed and locked, or the employee. Whereas with a modern ride, you'll have a sensor that will detect a limit switch. It will detect where the bar is, and if the bar is too far open, it won't let you send the train. Now, there is still some room for human error because the sensor doesn't know how big the guest is. So if you've got small guests, the bar could be closed down beyond the sensor, but you need the staff member to check that the restraint is still tight. And there is also always possibilities that, the sensor's moved out of position or something. So there is always still going to
Sure.
be some room. So you still have those human factors, but by having more sensors and more powerful computers, we can start to sort of minimize some of the room for human error. And these kind of control systems getting more and more advanced. So with, if you go back 20 years, you just had sensors that could locate the position of the vehicle. So you might have a proximity sensor. So each time a train went past, it knew that a train went past, but it didn't know which train it was. Whereas now they're using what's called RFID, radio frequency identification. So each train will have a unique tag on it. So not only does roller coaster know where trains are, but they know where each train is. And that also allows us to prevent accidents. For example, it can improve maintenance. So we know how many cycles each train on the ride has done, which can mean we can track things like wear and tear more easily.
Yeah, you know what and you know what I've been noticing the QR codes that are now on the rides that are being involved in some of the programming and the sensors and the control systems. Like what is it? Rise of the Resistance, I think, has the QR code. Same thing with the I don't know if you've been on the Universal uh Mario Kart,
I've not
right?
yet. No, I've not. It sounds good though. I've not been on one. I've been on ones with VR, but not ones with augmented reality yet.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah,
the
it's
It's wild. It's wild what's happening. But what I'm hearing from you is now is definitely the safest time to be on a ride. I've been to the Renaissance Festival and those are all man powered rides, right? So I understand what you're saying about where we've come in the early days of this, low tech where it was human assisted and a lot of the safety was we relied on people, which I still think, and this is my next question for you, what role does human centered design play in improving ride safety and staff performance? And you mentioned, we still have to have an attendant checking to make sure that the rider is the correct size, not too small for the restraints, because the restraint may be saying that they are buckled because it's monitoring that. But there are other elements that we can't eliminate humans from, right? At this point.
yeah, it depends. I mean, there's often this lag between technology as when rides kind of get up to date. So when a new piece of technology comes out, it's not necessarily going to be possible to immediately bring every ride up to date. So I suppose that's the
Sure.
first point. There's still a lot of rides in the 1970s or 1980s out there. But yeah, even for modern rides, yeah, there still is that room for sort of human error, because that's, I guess, partly the difference between a theme park where people can be unpredictable, and you've also got outside, you've
Yes.
got the weather conditions, and something like a factory where you've got tin cans, which, the tin can doesn't suddenly just decide to jump out the machine, whereas the person can. So there's definitely that side of things, I think. And in terms of the role of the ride operators, I suppose they're operating the ride safely, and they're also the kind of interlink between the kind of operations and the engineering. So I suppose the other role is to make sure that the engineers have the information that they need to sort of maintain the ride safely. So, for example, if a member of the public reports a safety concern to the ride operator, often they'll take the information and then the guest will leave. So the engineers are reliant on whatever information the operator's captured. So, for example, if a ride operator tells the if a guest tells the ride operator that they heard the ride making a strange noise, does the operator ask them whereabouts on the ride the noise was? Was it near the start or the end? Do they ask them what kind of noise it was, how loud it was? Because otherwise the engineer turns up and the ride operator says a member of the public said that the ride was making a strange noise, and the engineer starts asking questions and the guest is gone. So I think there's lots of roles that ride operators do have, and we are still reliant on sort of human safety, and there is only so much you can do with sort of technology at the moment.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I actually had a conversation with somebody at IAPA this past IAPA that even in the water park space, we're working on ways to better manage because, right now, so much of it is signals of controlling when, the next guest should go down the slide. And it's interesting because we're hearing more and more about how they are going to start introducing RFID or Bluetooth technology to be able to alert those ride operators or lifeguards in their cases many times of when and where that rider is at any point in the ride. So this is fascinating stuff. You're going to be my one of my son's favorite. My oldest son is always, so every time we go on a ride, he's always the one pointing out all the different gears and mechanics and how it's working. And I think he's going to really enjoy this conversation when he listens to it because, this is such a neat part of what we do, but something that the public's not openly talking about necessarily. I mean, we understand this. I mean, one of the reasons I love working in this industry is because we are so focused on safety and the experience and creating processes and procedures that make it so that our ride operators do know what to do and we can keep them and the public safe. I kind of want to jump to queue management and guest experience. And, what do you believe long queue lines, why do you believe long queue lines are still a persistent problem? And how do you believe we can better design to solve that?
So in terms of why it's still a persistent problem, I think there's a link with the safety. I think safety's got more sort of stringent, so ride operators are having to do more sort of physical checks. I think we're we're obviously making rides more accessible, which is definitely a good thing. We want people
Sure.
with disabilities to be able to go on rides, but we're expecting more from the rides, which is probably also contributing to queues. I think some of it's to do with social changes. So certainly in the UK, it's getting less acceptable to take children out of school to go to a theme park, say, which means that attendance is getting more bunched up. So I think there's various reasons why queuing's still a problem. In terms of, what's your second question? What can we do about it? Was
Yeah, what can we do to better design it? This is something that I'm definitely interested in because that's one of the things that a lot of, gate master partners, ticketing partners come to us seeing if we can solve these queue line problems. So I'm curious, what you're seeing in terms of design solves that.
I think it's broadly sort of 4 or 5 things you can do to sort of make queues shorter, and everything kind of comes into those sort of 4 or 5 ideas. So you can level off the peaks and troughs in attendance. So we know in an ideal world, a theme park or any other visitor attraction, it might be a zoo or an aquarium, it would get exactly the same number of visitors every day. But we know that's not going to happen because weather plays a part, school holidays
Sure.
play a part. So the bigger the peaks and troughs in attendance, the longer the queues tend to be. It's also the more evenly distributed around the attraction, the shorter the queues tend to be. So the bigger the attraction is, the more likely you are to find that people are bunched up in a particular place. So if you've got a big site, like a big amusement park, you'll find in the morning a lot of people are bunched up near the entrance because people come in and they've driven there, they want to get on a ride, so they see a big roller coaster, right, we'll queue for that. So a lot of people, and then as the day goes on, people filter through the attraction, and then later on in the day you can find that the queues are quite short near the entrance and quite busy near the back. So the distribution through the attraction, the number of attractions will obviously have an impact, and also the availability. So if attractions are closed a lot, either because of weather conditions or due to poor reliability or something else, that's effectively having low rideability is effectively decreasing your number of available attractions. And then throughputs is another really big one. So the more people you can get through each attraction each hour. So I think you often in America you tend to talk about hourly capacities more, and we tend to talk about throughputs more in the UK, but basically the same thing, an hourly capacity of throughput. It's how many people can you get through. And it could
Sure.
be a restaurant, or it could be through a ride or through a show. But how many people can you get through each attraction each hour? So very broadly, they're the kind of things you've got to play with. But then within each of those sort of categories, there's quite a lot of things you can do. There's a lot you can do to level off the peaks. There's a lot you can do to spread people out more evenly. There's a lot you can do to raise the throughputs.
Yeah, I appreciate that feedback, and I am curious, because I'm kind of jumping here because I want to make sure we cover all of this because this is a big topic when you really think about it. I mean, there's a lot. I'm sure that even our audience maybe doesn't even understand about ride design, which is something that's fairly new to me. I'm working on a project right now for a ride, hopefully the most accessible ride to ever be made, is a project that I'm working on with a team. And I've had to learn so much about this. This was such a different part of the industry than I had ever been involved in, but I really appreciate you coming on here talking about this because I'm also curious, what do you see in terms of trends in innovation and technology? And do you even see that we will be adopting things like AI or new vehicle designs that are going to make a big impact on that efficiency?
It's always hard predicting the future, isn't it? But
Sure,
certainly we've seen a lot of changes even in recent years in terms of ride design. So I mean, two of the big things that slow down sort of throughputs are bags and loose articles, and also seatbelts, because checking all the seatbelts as a sort of secondary sort of safety device tends to slow things down. Obviously, both of those things do also have a bearing on safety. If someone's taken a loose article on a ride and it falls out, it could hurt someone. And
sure.
often we use seatbelts partly as a secondary safety device. So if the safety harness or the safety bar fails, you've got something else holding people in. So you've got to be very careful with some of these sort of actual ride design to make sure that if you're going to try and improve throughputs, you've got to make sure you're doing it in a safe way. But yes, some recent changes, we've started seeing a lot more barrier-free entry to trains. So this is where the trains don't have any sides to them, so it allows people to step in and out of them very quickly. It's not probably suitable for rides where you're taking bags on with them. So if it's, say, a family roller coaster, you're going to take your bag on with them, you probably do need sides to the trains to help contain the bags. But for ones where you're leaving loose articles in a locker, that can sort of speed things up. We are seeing new restraint designs which don't have seatbelts. Now, there is a debate probably about whether we should still have the seatbelts, and there have been a couple of recent accidents and rides where there weren't seatbelts, where seatbelts might have prevented them. So I think there is a debate about how we do that safely. But we used to have what we call ratcheting restraints, where they would sort of have a set of teeth and they would close between a ratchet. Whereas now we're seeing a lot more hydraulic restraints. And the advantage of hydraulic restraints is that they can close in any position. So they can close more flush against the rider. And then you can have multiple hydraulic cylinders in the restraint to give you kind of some level of redundancy. But like I said, I think there is a debate about whether we should still have seatbelts on some of those rides. And but some of this stuff is low tech. So there's a lot of stuff around the architecture of stations. So on some rides, you enter the station from an elevated height so that the guests can see what's going on the platform, and also where you put the exit on the platform. So do you put the exit on the middle or at one end of the station? Because if it's at one end, you find that people at the opposite end of the train have to walk down the whole length of the platform to get off. Whereas if you put the exit in the middle of the station, everyone can get to the exit, but no one has to walk as far to get to the exit because no one's having to walk more than half the length of the platform. In terms of AI, we certainly are seeing a lot in terms of, well, one in terms of maintenance. I said if you can improve ride reliability, then that's not improving the throughputs, but it is more ride availability means that the queues are going to be shorter because people are spread between more rides. So certainly in
Sure.
terms of maintenance, we're using AI to start looking at trends. So you can feed lots of data into AI. It might be a temperature of a motor, it might be vibrations on a support, and the AI can then analyze that data and start to predict maintenance. You could do that before with a spreadsheet, but it would be very time consuming. We're kind of at a very early stage of this. I mean, AI, I think, is used more in some other areas. So, for example, if you had a production line in a factory, if one machine breaks down, the whole production line stops. So there's a massive amount of money riding on each machine. In a theme park, if you've got 30 rides, if one ride breaks down, the other 29 are still able to run. So the economics in a theme park are slightly different to some other industries. So I think as an industry at the moment, we're at a point where things like production lines in factories are starting to use AI a lot. But as an attractions industry, we're still trying to work out whether it's economical to use AI in that way. And also, we're using AI more in things like phone apps. So in terms, I said that we want to try and spread our guests evenly through the park, and a lot of parks are using phone apps to nudge guests towards quiet areas of the park. So can you use AI to predict which areas of the park are going to be quiet at different times, and can you then sort of nudge people towards those areas?
That's interesting. That's really interesting. Now, would the AI, if it was being used to predict where people would go throughout the park, is it using, I mean, it's obviously using data that it's collected on human behavior up to that point, right?
Yeah, so yeah, I'd normally, I think, be using. There would be a predictive element. So, for example, if it's a wet day, for example, you might know that people are more likely to cluster near the indoor attractions than if it's. And if you've got, say, a water park in the park, you know that as the temperature goes down, that's going to have a direct bearing on how many people are attracted to the water park. So, I guess
Sure.
it could get quite sophisticated. Depending on what kind of budget you've got. And I guess, the Disneys and the Universals are going to have a much bigger budget for this than somewhere small. And it's not necessarily going to be what might be viable for sort of Disney, won't necessarily be viable for a small family run amusement park. But yes, it could use machine learning to look at trends through times of day. But there's also going to be unpredictable. It's also going to be about responding to things that are unpredictable. So, for example, let's say that a roller coaster breaks down. We might have another roller coaster nearby that doesn't normally have a particularly long queue, but when the roller coaster next door breaks down, suddenly the queue gets a lot longer. So I suppose with AI, as soon as that first roller coaster breaks down, the AI now knows that the queue is about to get a lot longer for the ride next to it. So I guess it can use a predictive element in that sense as well, sort of theoretically.
Yeah, this is fascinating. This is fascinating. Well, we are getting close to the end of time, and I have some questions about your book. And I know that you wrote Absolute Efficiency, which has really shaped your perspective on operational challenges in theme parks. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and what kind of led you? I'm curious. I'm actually in the process of writing my own book, but and my husband's an author, but I'm always fascinated by people who can put that down in a way that they can explain these things to people, and how many insights we can get from being able to write down these experiences that we have. But what really shaped you, and what prompted you to write this?
Well, I can't wait to read your book as well. So I'll keep an eye out on that, definitely. So it's a combination of things. I mean, since the internet and since print on demand publishing, the amount of theme park management books has sort of increased substantially from pretty much close to zero to quite a sort of lot of books. But most of the theme park management books are on leadership or customer service. There was nothing about queue management. So it was about a
Sure.
bit about a gap in the market. And also most of the books are about Disney. So my book does have Disney on actually on the front cover, but I wanted to include a range of parks rather than just focusing on one. And queuing, I think for a lot of parks is the biggest source of guest complaints. People complain about the price. There's often complaints about food, but often the biggest source of complaints, particularly if you look at things like TripAdvisor, often queuing is the biggest source of complaints. And I think
Sure.
sometimes it's a perception amongst the public that the staff don't care. The staff don't really care how long the queues are. But having worked in parks, you do, because for the sake of argument, let's imagine I'm working on a ride and there's a 10-minute queue and someone gets to the front and their child's too short to go on the ride. I tell the family that the child's too short but they've only been queuing for 10 minutes, so the odds of them getting really angry are probably relatively small. But if they've been queuing for 2 hours and they get to me, I tell them actually the child's not going to be able to ride because they're too short, they're probably going to get angry very quickly. So things escalate a lot faster. And also, going back to the safety, a lot of theme parks, I noticed their main strategy for managing queues was to tell the staff to work faster and basically just keep putting people pressure and to work faster. And one that can, if people are just constantly being put under pressure to work faster, it tends to lead to people cutting corners, which kind of creates accidents. And also, it creates this background level of stress, and all that stress also, it's very bad for people's health. Bad for people's blood pressure. It tends to, when people are stressed, their immune system starts to shut down. It's
Sure.
bad for people's health, and also people tend to make more mistakes when they're stressed. So I realised that it was a combination, really, but it was a gap in the market, and also I figured it was really important to the attractions industry. And I've been sort of working on it for a while, and then I lost my job in COVID. So I suddenly thought, I've wanted to get a book written and published for a while. And if I'm unemployed in a pandemic and I can't do it, I'm never going to. So I thought, well, this is my moment.
Good for you, Neil. I'm so glad to hear that you took that time to put together something like this because I don't disagree. I mean, I we work with attractions at Gatemaster and this just what you said, a lot of the reviews that we see that are of a negative nature tend to be around ride queuing because you're right, it puts people in a more heightened sense of stress, and it's both the guest and the attendants. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been to parks on the busiest day of the year, Labor Day here in the United States, one of them. We're finishing up our summer season, and we end up having attendants behind the counter crying because they are stressed. And I think it is important that we educate ourselves on how to create better working environments for our teams, because that's where mistakes happen too, if we're being completely real. From what you've said all throughout this show is, just like with the young drivers, if we can just end on that, distractions create more problems, it sounds like, than anything else. Because it isn't the age necessarily of operating a car, it's who's in the vehicle with them, which I think translates to distraction, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think, going back to the root causes, I think it makes a difference where the control box is. If you have a control box next to the queue line, it's very easy for people in the queue to distract the operator. I often think it's good practice to have the
Yeah,
control box and the control panel away from where the guests are. Because, yeah, I mean, things like that, it's easy to just blame the person who got distracted. But if you can remove the distractions, yeah, that
sure.
makes a big difference.
Well, or even I know so many parks are having to move to where there's no cell phones on their
Oh,
team
yeah.
members,
Well, no,
right?
definitely,
Like, get rid of
definitely.
the cell phone, because that's a huge distraction. I mean, it's a distraction for me just during the show. Someone trying to call me, I was like, "Hey, don't you know we're live right now?" But yeah, I totally can appreciate all of those things that you're saying with regards to this. For our audience that's listening today, is there if somebody has questions or wants to get a hold of you or wants to get a hold of this book that you've written, Absolute Efficiency, what's the best way for them to reach you?
So I'm on LinkedIn, or you can, if you Google Universal Verification Limited, that's the company I work for. So yeah, if you use LinkedIn for Neil Wilson and Universal Verification Limited, or any emails to Universal Verification will get through to me. And in terms of a book, it's actually, there's not that many publishers that do theme park books. It's published with the Theme Park Press, and they recently, unfortunately, went out of business. So I'm in the process of getting it. I think I'm going to self-publish it. So I'm in the process of getting it sort of republished at the moment.
Nice. Well, I wish you the best for that. And maybe by the time this is out, on the podcast, because it does take us a few weeks, sometimes even a month or so to get this up there. We can certainly make sure to post those links in our recaps of this show. And if you are watching on replay or you are watching a recap of this show, please let us know in the comments that you've visited us and if you enjoyed this show. And I'm sure that both Neil and I would love to hear from you. So, Neil, thank you so much for being on here and sharing so many of your insights. I know this is such a big, I don't even think scratched the surface of this just from from both studying who you are and what you are doing in this industry and the book that you're creating, but also, the entire aspect around technology and human interaction with regards to ride safety and how to design cues. I think that's such an important topic. So I really appreciate you sharing all of that with us today. But I know that this is such a big topic. We might need to have you back on this show to recap. So, how about this? When you get that book done, I'd love to have you back so we can cover more of that and share this information with the industry. Does that sound good?
That'd be great. No, thanks. It's been really good coming on here. So yeah, no, thanks, Sondra. And yeah, like I said to you before we started recording, thanks to Maria and Destiny and everyone else behind the scenes who's also worked on this podcast. I really appreciate it.
Hey, we appreciate you. We couldn't do this without guests like you being willing to share, what you're sharing with the audience today and just trying to help move this industry forward. It's an industry I love. It's an industry you love. You clearly are passionate about it enough that you've educated yourself on so much of this and you're even creating, documenting and creating a book that's going to help people do that. So thank you. Thank you so much for being willing to share and to go live with me today because that's not easy. That's not an easy thing to get up here and talk to people about these ideas. So I for one certainly understand it. So I appreciate you being here and sharing those insights.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you.
See you soon, Neil.
So yeah, thanks, and thanks to everyone who listens to this. Thank you.
Thank you. To wrap up this show today, I really appreciate all of you who are listening. This was a great show with Neil Wilson, and we were talking about ride safety and how the human factor in ride safety and queue design is such a necessary element of what we need to be discussing with regards to our theme parks, amusement parks, water parks, any of our attractions. When we're just talking an attraction in general, I think there's some really great insights, and I'm looking forward to uh, Neil's book. So, if you are somebody like Neil who has information or insights that you can share with our industry in an effort to keep moving it forward, that's really what this show is about. Having conversations about what's happening in the industry, maybe giving you some additional insights. I know I learned something new today. I learn something new every time I have a guest. I say this all the time that I feel like I'm the luckiest person in the world because I do get to spend time with these great people who are doing these great things. And, just so much gratitude to them for being willing to share these ideas with all of you and the world. Uh, if you are interested in being a guest on this show, please visit me at Live with Sondra. You can see all of the recaps of previous shows as well as a form on how you can be my next guest. And I hope that you will join me. I'm going to be signing off today. This is Sondra Shannon, your host of Live with Sondra, and I look forward to seeing you for the next show.